about me. I had a career in the Department of Agriculture in New South Wales, which is called something else now. That's what governments do, to change the names of everything, think that's progress. But anyway, did research on things like lychees, mangoes, custard apples, and just down Alstonville down near Ballina. So most of you probably know where that is, actually, but most people in Australia don't know where it is. But lovely spot, and I really enjoyed my work. But in 1994, I was called to work in creation ministry, and it was Creation magazine before I had anything to do with it, and other things like that. But also when we were watching nature documentaries on television, we would be talking about it and showing them how to distinguish truth from fiction, and it's all blended together. And this is what people absorb. I think wonderful nature facts with David Attenborough and so on, and they absorb the rubbish that goes along with it. I think it's all the same, and of course it's not. So we're going to talk about that now. Why evolution is not true from a biological point of view. Now, Dr. Taz Walker is going to deal with it from a geological point of view, so I won't be touching on that. Why evolution is not true. This statement by Sir Julian Huxley, who was head of UNESCO for many years, really summarises what the whole evolutionary idea is about. In the evolutionary pattern of thought, there's no longer either need or room for the supernatural. The earth was not created, it evolved. So did all the animals and plants that inhabit it, including our human cells, mind and soul, as well as brain and body, so did religion. So everything evolved. We invented God. God didn't invent us. That's what this whole evolutionary idea is about. It's fundamentally not about science, it's about God. And it's made to sound scientific to people who are trained in science, and to many people who are trained in science get sucked in as well. But fundamentally, it's about God, about getting rid of God. And it deals with the whole of life, the origin of the universe and everything. But we're just going to be dealing with biology this morning. Now, is it opposed to God? Clearly it is. So what does the Bible say about things that are opposed to God? What should we do about them? Apostle Paul gives the instruction here. We demolish arguments and every pretension sets us up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. It's a good motto for apologetics, isn't it? So we're going to do some demolition here this morning. Are we demolishing atheists? Is that what we're doing? No, we're demolishing arguments, okay? Now, in this postmodern era in which we live, people think you don't demolish arguments because that's insulting and that's intolerant and all this sort of stuff. But folks, if we don't demolish the arguments, no one's going to come to Christ. Because it's the arguments that keep people away. It's their excuse for unbelief. Now, I can't deal with everything this morning. Neither can Taz, and neither can the whole seminar. But there's a lot more material available, and every day on our website there's new material. Because people are busy, we'll put out an Infobites, which is an email news, and some of you already get this, I know. But to tell people about some of the articles that have been on the website that you might have missed. And so some of the things we think perhaps you shouldn't have missed because you could use them in witnessing or be an encouragement to you. So you can sign up for the Infobites. There's a form there that you can fill in, and it'll be out on the tables out the back there. The postcode is so we can tell you about things in your area that might be coming out of a seminar like this, for example. We can tell you about that with an email. Okay, the Bible tells us, that's our authority as Christians, that God created different kinds of things. And the first thing he created were fruit trees. Genesis chapter 1 there, verse 11 and 12. I like that because I did research in fruit trees. Fruit trees were the first thing God created. That makes my research important. And that's one of my favourite trees, which is a mango tree, and you'll all be aware of that here. And it says that fruit trees produce fruit with seed in them after their kind. And there's mango fruit and mango seed. Now what happens when you plant a mango seed? You get a mango tree, don't you? Okay, eventually. So mango seeds produce mango trees. And 10 times in Genesis chapter 1, God said his pattern of creation of living things, they were to reproduce after their kind. And here's the pattern. Mangoes produce mango fruit, produce mango seeds, produce mango trees. What do dogs do? They produce more dogs, don't they? What do cats do? They produce more cats. What do people do? Produce more people. You know, it's the most repeated experiment on earth, isn't it? That like begets like. But what is evolution? Evolution is the doctrine. No, like doesn't beget like. Over millions of years, they change one thing into the other. And so this idea, in fact, here it's summarised in New Scientist by Simon Conway Morris, once we were worms. Not you have worms. Once you were a worm. Millions of years ago, you're a worm. And worms change into people. That's what evolution's about. So they had this idea of this tree of life idea, the origin of life in the beginning, where life just popped into existence from chemicals on the earth, which is preposterous, actually. I would debate that with anybody at any university, that life could make itself, and every day the problem gets more difficult. But this idea of all living things came from a common ancestor back in the past. But you think about it, and this is supposed to be recorded in the fossils, and I'll show you it isn't. But the fossils that eat things. And things are killing one another. Struggle for survival, suffering, extinction is all part of this whole process, isn't it? And so really the tree of life is really a tree of death, isn't it? It's a tree of death and suffering over millions of years. That's what people... And folks, when people try to marry that with the Bible, you have to try and marry millions of years of death and suffering with the Bible. Where do you put it? You can't put it after people, because there hasn't been millions of years after people. So you have to put it before the people. You have death and suffering before Adam and Eve in the garden. You undermine the whole concept of the goodness of God, the very good creation in the beginning. The basis of the gospel, that death and suffering came through sin, through Adam's sin, and Jesus came to die for that reason. You undermine everything, if you think about it. And you certainly undermine the authority of God's word. But sadly, many people do that. See, elephants and mice supposedly had a common ancestor. Yes, this is the doctrine of evolution. In fact, if you trace the elephants and mouse ancestors backwards, you find that they say, in the fossil record, you find there somewhere an animal which was neither elephant nor mouse which gave rise to both. Things don't reproduce after their kind. They just change one thing into the other by this process of evolution. Do you know that dolphins and whales are supposed to have once been land animals? This is actually one of the major indoctrination things that's used at present in schools and universities to indoctrinate students and convince them that evolution happens, is that this supposed whale sequence they have, which is crumbling very rapidly, I might add. One of the big problems they have is recently they found a whale fossil which predates any of their supposed ancestors. The problem. Anyway, but just imagine, I do a bit of surfing, and I love getting out to surf and having a paddle and having a surf, and I love it when the dolphins are around. But I really would be mind-boggled one day if I saw this. But this is the idea that a land animal became a sea creature like a dolphin. I mean, a dolphin is incredibly well adapted to living in the water. A cow isn't. But this is the story of evolution. Well, I want to show you why it's impossible. What we know today from biology, from science, shows that evolution is impossible. And it's the reason why you get shouted down if you oppose it, because they know they can't stand the glare of the actual facts. And so the approach is to shout anybody down who actually dares stand up against it. In fact, not just shout down, but if you happen to be in university and stand against evolution, you'll lose your job. And the documentary Expelled talks about that. And so this supposed tolerance is a tolerance of everything except God's truth. So, the reason evolution is impossible, a major reason, is this: that we've discovered that living things are chock-a-block full of information, and the information is written on the DNA. What do we mean by information? We're talking about instructions on the DNA for how to make things. For example, when a mango tree reproduces itself through a seed, what's happening there? Well, it copies its information into the seed, and so all the information to make a mango tree is sitting here in the seed. When the seed starts to grow, that information is processed. All the instructions are processed for how to make a mango tree. And if you're a human, all the instructions are in the egg and the sperm that join together to make an embryo. And so these instructions are incredible if you think about it. I mean, if you're going to make a building or a computer or anything complex, you need specifications, don't you? That's what's written on the DNA, specifications of living things. And so if you think about a microbe, how much information are we talking about for the simplest microbe that can actually live? We're talking about a book the size of the Bible. If you just wrote out all the coded instructions on the DNA, you could do it, write it in a book. It'd be a waste of paper because no one would be able to read it. But it's recorded on computer disks and things these days. But it's information. And biologists are involved in decoding the information and might figure out what it all means. How are these instructions interpreted? How are they translated into proteins and body components and kidneys and eyes and all the other things that make us? Well, microbes don't have kidneys and eyes, do they? So they don't need all those instructions. But they do need a book of instructions to operate as a microbe and to reproduce themselves. But just imagine how a book of instructions to make the simplest microbe could just pop into existence. Not only do you need the book of instructions, you need to be able to decode the instructions, to read them and make them into things. You need the whole apparatus to go with it. And it's mind-boggling. And it's ridiculous to suggest that such a thing could just pop into existence from some chemistry in a warm pond on Earth or something or other. It is indefensible. But here they say, well, let's just assume that life popped into existence. How did it change into all the living things on Earth? How did a microbe change into a horse, for example? Because you're going to have to add stacks of information to a microbe to make a horse. Specifications for how to make muscle and nerves and all the things that make a horse that microbes don't have. What about humans? We're talking about a book of 1,000 books, like the size of the Bible, to record the human DNA information. When we talk about information, the atheists and evolutionists, they get very tricky here, and they like to talk about information away, which means that actually random strings of letters is information in their view. So, just to talk about information for a minute, she has an automobile. Does that contain information? Of course it does, yes. It has 21 letters. But what about the next one, which I can't pronounce? Does that contain any information? None that you can see. It might mean something in Icelandic or something, but it doesn't mean anything in English, does it? So the decoding system, you see, you have in your brain, which looks for information, you can't know there's nothing in that, but it's still 21 letters, isn't it? So it contains no information. It's got 21 letters still. What about the next one? Sue has a red Porsche. Does that contain more information than the first string? It does, doesn't it? Because the first one just says, she, a lady, has a car, an automobile. It doesn't say what sort, it doesn't what so. But the last one says a name, and says the type of car, and even the colour of the car, same number of letters. So you see that the number of letters, you can't just count the number of letters and work out how much information there is. It's not simple like that. But you can also see that random strings of letters aren't information. Now, this is the trickery they use at university, and the people like Richard Dawkins, they try to say this is information. And so if you randomly add some new letters, you're adding information. And so that we randomly add new letters, we create all the new information to change a microbe of one book of information into a human with 1,000 books of information, adding 999 books of information by random changes to the one book that the microbe had. This is what they claim. And so the mechanism for evolution is first of all mutations and natural selection. That was basically what you first. So mutations are copying mistakes that occur when the information is transferred from you to your child, from microbe to the offspring or whatever, dog to pup. Mutations are copying mistakes. So instead of a C, you've got a T on the DNA. Or you've got an extra letter, because you have to get lots of extra letters to actually generate the 999 extra books of information, don't you? So it's not just a matter of changing letters, you've got to add letters. And this is where this trickery comes in, to say that any string of letters is information. No, it's not. It has to specify something. In fact, Carl Sagan was an atheist. I say he was an atheist because he died. And he's no longer an atheist. Will mutations help? Mutations occur at random and are almost uniformly harmful. It is rare that a precision machine is improved by a random change in the instructions for making it. Well, of course. Think about some random changes in the computer code on my laptop. Would it make it work better? No. It'd wreck it. And that's what they're claiming, that these random changes actually created the new information. In fact, he's wrong about it's rare that precision machines improve by random change. It doesn't happen. I don't know of any example of a precision machine that's been improved by a random mutation. In fact, here's an example of a mutant. Not this is a normal budgerigar. But a mutation in the information for making feathers, says how to make feathers, results in the budgerigar not being able to make normal feathers, and this is what it looks like. It's called the feather duster budgie, because about all it's good for is a feather duster. It lived about 12 months because the people who owned it looked after it, but then it died because, obviously, it's not fit to survive, is it? And that's what mutations do, they mess up stuff. Now, sometimes they're helpful, sometimes they actually help survival, but overwhelmingly, they actually destroy the information, they don't create it. In fact, we have over 1,000 human diseases caused by mutations. There's a couple of websites actually devoted to the mutations that cause disease. And there are 11,000 mutations being discovered every year that actually cause disease. Or they call them functional, which means that they don't actually cause disease, but they don't actually help. So you still work, the systems still work, but, and quite a lot of them actually cause disease. But there's no website devoted to beneficial mutations that actually create information to make evolution believable. But then someone says, well, what about antibiotic resistance? Well, antibiotic resistance proves evolution. That's what we're told at school and university. And if we didn't have evolution, we wouldn't understand antibiotic resistance. Well, let me show you what happens with a typical example of antibiotic resistance. This is a bacterial cell, and you can see there's a little thing representing a factory. Well, living things don't actually produce smoke and stuff, but they actually make things without pollution. But the idea is the antibiotic actually will kill the bacterium. That's if you've got a sickness or something, and you take an antibiotic, and you want the antibiotic to kill the bacterium. So little Pac-Man here, the green things, represent an enzyme which actually breaks down the antibiotic. So the bacterium normally produces a little bit of the enzyme. This is what happens. You can see there the antibiotics coming into the cell, but there's not enough of the Pac-Man, not enough of the enzymes to break it down, and consequently the cell succumbs to the antibiotic and it kills it, which is what you want to happen if you've got a disease caused by this bacterium. Now, the factory can have an error, a mutation in the control system, so that it's out of control and producing stacks and stacks of the enzyme, the Pac-Man. Now normally it needs a small amount of the enzyme for its normal function, so it controls it, it actually limits the amount produced. But an error in the control system can result in it going flat out, producing lots of the enzyme. This is what happens then. So got lots and lots of the enzyme being produced, without smoke I might add, but just to show the idea it's rapidly going on. And so lots of enzyme means it breaks down all the antibiotic and the bacterium is resistant. That's not what you want to happen. But that's how antibiotic resistance happens in bacteria. It's due to mutation, this one. But it's not due to adding anything, is it? It's actually destroyed something. In fact, you can also get, because the antibiotic is taken up through a transport channel through the cell wall or cell membrane, the transport channel can have an error or a mutation in the information for making it so that the bacterium doesn't take up the antibiotic. What does that mean? It also doesn't take up the stuff it needs as well either, because the antibiotic hitches a ride on a transport channel that normally takes up other things the bacterium needs. So you can see how the processes don't actually speak of evolution at all. Another process that can bring about antibiotic resistance is the bacterium can grab information from another bacterium that already has antibiotic resistance. They're called plasmids, and they can actually form a little tube between themselves and swap the information. That's actually a very common way in which antibiotic resistance is acquired by a bacterium. Now what we're finding inside living things is just absolutely mind-bogglingly complex. And I'm going to give you some idea of the sort of sophisticated nanotechnology that's happening inside us right now. Because right now inside us, there's a delivery system delivering packages of proteins inside our cells to different destinations. And this is an animation here. There's an article in Creation magazine about this. But you can see this little thing here. It's actually a protein, and it walks around a road network, which is also made of a different protein called microtubules. And this is called kinesin or kinesin. And it uses an energy compound for each step it takes. And the bag is actually full of proteins. And the proteins are actually manufactured with an address label on them to say whether to go to in the cell. Now, you remember back to high school when you did biology, and everybody did this in general science, you label a cell. You had cell wall, nucleus, remember that? You remember at least that much? Okay, there are a few other bits you probably labelled as well at the time you've forgotten, but things like mitochondria, and nucleolus, and Golgi apparatus, and where you're losing an hour, yes, okay. But so if a protein has to go to the mitochondrion, for example, it's manufactured with an address label that says, take me to mitochondria. And they're packaged up like this, and they're sent to their destination. Some proteins have to go outside the cell, especially in our bodies, because cells communicate with one another with proteins. And that's not understood much at all yet. But immunology and all that, they're studying all this, trying to work it out. And so this is actually a fairly simple protein, about 300 amino acids long. Now, what are they? Amino acids are the little things that compose a protein. So when you digest proteins, like you have eggs for breakfast, it's broken down in your gut, broken down to amino acids. Your body takes up the amino acids and constructs them into proteins that you need, like to repair your skin or repair your hair. Okay, mine's not working real well. And so on. And to produce enzymes that digest your food. They're all proteins. Our bodies can make, nobody's really quite sure how many, but probably 1 million proteins. It used to be said 100,000, but it's now thought to be over 1 million different proteins our bodies make. Different cells, different times make over 1 million proteins. And they're all coded in the DNA in 23,000 genes. 23,000 genes, 23,000 proteins, 1 million proteins. How does that work? Well, the genes have multiple functions. Some genes can actually produce hundreds of proteins by reading them in different ways. And they had all this DNA which was called junk. Why did they call it junk? Because they were evolutionists. And they needed junk for evolution. It was found that it's not junk at all. It was actually involved in determining how to read these genes in different ways. How did all that just happen by chance? Now, how did this happen by chance? Think about this. 300 amino acids, there are 20 different amino acids. Get your calculator out, work out the probability of getting this, just this protein, a small protein, by comparison with lots of other very important proteins in our bodies. Get your calculator out, and you go 1 over 20, which is the chance of getting the first amino acid right, okay, 1 over 20. What's the chance of getting the next amino acid right? 1 over 20. And multiply 1 over 20 300 times. When you can short circuit a bit with the calculator, you can go calculate 1 over 20 y to the x 300. Still won't work because the calculator will say error. Because I can't show that number, it's too small. The number is much less than 10 to the minus 99, so I can't show it. In fact, it would never happen. Even if the whole universe was an experiment, with every atom in the universe an experiment for every possible molecular vibration of all the billions of years they claim, it would never happen. Not one protein. How many do we need for a simple microbe? We need 400 approximately for a simple microbe that can just live. Life would never form itself. Life would never evolve. Life can't go from one step to another because there are no way of creating the information by natural processes. Information comes from a mind. And we're talking about an incredible mind here. We're talking about a mind far beyond our minds. The mind of God. And that's the problem here. It's not that biology doesn't speak of design. It speaks of a designer far superior to us. That's the problem. If you could attribute the design in biology to a human agent or even ET, it would be okay. But it actually speaks of God in a very loud fashion. And that's why it's not allowed. It's about God, not about science. In fact, Richard Dawkins said this: biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. I would say, Richard, perhaps they have the appearance of having been designed for a purpose because they were. Isn't science about following the logic? Following the evidence wherever it leads? No, it's actually about trying to work away from God. The human heart is desperately wicked and deceitful above all things, and it doesn't matter whether you're a scientist or a labourer, it's the same. Science doesn't protect people from being sinners. In fact, it's become a justification for sin. So what about natural selection? That's the other component of neo-Darwinism, the whole modern synthesis they call it. Well, let me illustrate natural selection, and you'll see that it doesn't help either. Here's a couple of dogs. And the red things in the dogs represent the genes for hair length. Now, they don't look like that. This just gives you an idea. So this one here says make short hair, this one says make long hair. Okay, so just assume a pair of genes that determine the length of the hair. So a short hair gene and a long hair gene, in this case, a blending inheritance, you end up with medium length hair. Now when they reproduce, and you can go back to high school, you did this in general science as well, you get one gene from dad and one gene from mum. So you can get two short hair genes together and you get an offspring with shorter hair than mum and dad. Okay? What happens if you get a short hair gene with a long hair gene? There's two possibilities there, but you get similar to mum and dad, medium length hair. What happens if you get two long hair genes together? You get a long hair wolf, a long hair dog. Okay, after the flood, Noah's flood, there's an ice age, and during the ice age, which wolves were best adapted to the cold conditions in the icy areas? Of course, the long-haired ones were more adapted. So the other ones died off. This is a natural selection operation. The unfit die off and the fit survive. And so we end up with two long-haired wolves surviving. And what genes do they have? They only have long-haired genes, don't they? So what sort of wolves can they produce, or dogs can they produce? They can produce only long-haired ones, can't they? So they marry and have children. And then these little ones, you've got long-haired ones. And they're all long-haired ones, all of them. Long-haired, all adapted to the cold conditions because, and what's happened? Can you ever get a short-haired gene again? Got a short-haired wolf again? No, you can breed these as long as you like, they're gone. The genes are gone. So what's natural selection done? It's eliminated information.
Could there be a mutation to give a short?
Oh, that's a possibility. It depends on how hair length is determined. A mutation could restore short hair. It's more likely to get no hair than short hair. And that mightn't be very adaptive because you get sunburnt, but yeah, mutation would be a lot more likely to do that. But certainly mutations have been involved in differences in hair colour. For example, you can have black colour, and mutation can actually reduce the amount of melanin produced, so you end up with brown instead of black. But then again, Dr. Jen Leitner, who's a creationist veterinary scientist, she argues, in fact, God created animals with this sort of floppy genome in this spot where it determines hair colour, so that it actually would change and allow varieties of coat colours in animals. And so if you're in the Arctic, for example, you end up with white hair. If you're in the tropics, you end up with brown or something that's better coloured to better match the environment. Yes, but basically natural selection doesn't create information. Only mutations are the only game in town to create information. But mutations aren't up to the job. The sort of things they can do doesn't explain how you can get kinesin or any of the other multiple things we see in living things that require incredible combinations of things to work together. And so natural selection only sorts existing information and gets rid of it. It doesn't create information. So when someone gets up and says, here's an example of natural selection, therefore evolution is a fact, they are fibbing. Or they don't understand it. One of the two. But that's what's often done in schools and universities and nature documentaries and television. An example of natural selection is supposed to be evolution. No, natural selection is not evolution. The only game in town to create the information is mutations. And they're not up to the job. Now, school textbooks are now downplaying mutations, and they're trying to sort of make it all fuzzy. And they have all these different processes, they talk about gene duplication, they talk about, they've got a whole range of different sorts of mutations. They're all mutations still. But they make it sound as if they've got something extra up their sleeve. Because they know the game. And people who write the textbooks know that we're onto one. Right? But they're all mutations. There's no other game in town other than random changes to existing information to explain all the new information. And so evolution doesn't have a mechanism. Mutations don't work, natural selection doesn't create information, and so it doesn't have a mechanism. In fact, there was a meeting a few years ago called the Altenberg 16. It was a conference of 16 top evolutionists. They met together to discuss the crisis in evolution. What was the crisis? The crisis was they realised, with all the information from molecular biology, modern science, that evolution was actually running out of puff. And they had this meeting together to figure out where could they go with it. And there was a book written about it, and you can look it up on creation.com, a review of it. But basically, the revelations from that meeting were telling. And the revelations, for example, some of the top evolutionists admitting that mutations really aren't up to the game in terms of explaining information in living things. And so, we look at the variety in living things, like there's a Great Dane and Chihuahua, and there's quite a lot of variety in dogs. Are dogs all one kind? Yes. Of course, there's the same created kind. They can reproduce together. My wife's a vet. She assures me that this is possible. Well, anyway, with a bit of help in this case, but it can be done. And what about this one? This is only a mother could love it. But people have actually helped the process here of selection, haven't they? But nevertheless, it indicates how much variety you can get within a created kind. And you get all sorts of dogs. Dogs do change, but what are they? They're still dogs, aren't they? Now, the British Museum of Natural History has a big sign up which says, Darwin said breeding of dogs shows evolution. No, dogs are still dogs. It's a pretty simple, isn't it, really? Dogs are still dogs. They haven't changed into cats. It's not evolution. So you get all sorts of varieties of people and frogs and horses and palm trees and so on. But you don't get any evidence that one thing changes into the other. In fact, there's an evolutionist who actually admitted this. He said this. He's an Australian guy, it was an Australian journal anyway, said we can go on examining natural variation at all levels, as well as hypothesising about speciation events in bedbugs, brachiopods, and bears, and brachiopods, until the planet reaches oblivion. But we still only end up with bedbugs, brachiopods, and bears. None of these body plans will transform into rotivores, roundworms, or rhynchoceles. He's got it, hasn't he? He understands the concept of a kind. One basic kind won't change into another by these processes. You get variation within the kind. That's not evolution. That's not what has to be explained if this big tree of life idea has any credibility. This is what happens. At university, at school and so on, I see evolution happening in my lab. It's a fact. And some moths with different coloured wings or something or other. And the student thinks, oh, wow, they've proven evolution, you know. What? Microbes to microbiologists evolution. Goo to you by way of the zoo. No, they haven't demonstrated that. It's a con job. It's a con job. So, that's called equivocation. It's a trickery used in debating. It's to switch the definition of a word in the middle of the story. So, let's talk about the created kinds. What do we mean by a created kind? How do we define them? Well, in Hebrew, the word is bara, created, min, kind, created kind. And so it's been joined together to make a sort of English word derived from Hebrew, bara min, to represent created kinds. That's another way of saying created kind. Frank Marshall, who's a creationist biologist, proposed that if two species will hybridise to produce at least an embryo, they're the same created kind, the same baramin. If we think about, for example, the horse kind, equity, the family, at this particular case, it probably equates to the biological classification of the family, but not in all cases. And so we have donkeys and horses and zebras and different things that actually will hybridise and produce zonkies and all sorts of other crazy mixtures. And sometimes they're fertile, but the fact that even hybridise produce an offspring suggests that they are derived from the original created kind. Through the degenerative changes that have happened over the years, they're no longer fully compatible, but that can happen through natural processes. So what we're talking about here, this is one example, is variation within the created kind. There is variation, but it's within limits. You get varieties of horses, donkeys, zebras and so on, but you don't get them changing into cows, for example. So we have the created kinds originally at creation, and then we've got different species here. Of course, in there's the flood as well, which of course had a profound effect on the earth and the differentiation of different kinds, different varieties of animals and plants around the world. So the evolutionary tree up the top there is a single origin of life, diversifying all the different things on Earth. Universities often mischaracterise the creationist view and say, we believe, these dumb creationists, they believe that God created everything in the beginning just as we see it today, which is completely rubbish. But that's what they do, and some students go, oh yeah, they're stupid, aren't they? And so what is the real view is that we have a creationary orchard where there are different kinds diversifying within the kind, adapting to different environments, like polar bears and brown bears and black bears, are all derived from the original bear kind. And so, if you're looking at the classification of living things, of course species is the lowest level, some are subspecies and variety, but you know, humans are Homo, genus, sapiens is a species, okay? So Homo sapiens, then you've got a family, then you've got an order, class, phylum, kingdom. Well, the biblical kind usually, in many cases, at the level of family or genus. So humans at the level of genus. So Homo erectus is a human, fully human. Neanderthals are fully human, and so on. But this is according to the biological classification. So, but sometimes it's a level of order. Like some of the birds, for example, it's a level of order. Because the classification system isn't derived from biblical concepts. It's just done by, you know, all sorts of. And depends on where you're dealing with, plants or animals, birds and things. People have used different sort of criteria. And so it's not consistent. So you can't say the biblical kind is always at this level. It varies depending on what you're talking about. So there's actually a group of creationist scientists around the world are working together to actually try and define what the biblical kinds are. And they're quite an interesting process. Now, if the evolutionary tree was correct, there should be stacks and stacks of fossil evidence showing the derivation of one kind into another, if it happened over hundreds of millions of years. But in fact, the fossils don't show the evolutionary transitions that are supposed to occur. Like you think about the elephant and the mouse. Are the fossils there to show that there was a common ancestor and there was, you know, all the way up to elephants on the one hand and mice on the other? No, they're not there. In fact, Dr. Colin Patterson at the British Museum of Natural History, he was the senior fossil expert, senior paleontologist, and he said, someone wrote a book about what evolutionists were saying about the fossils, and he was asked, Colin Patterson wrote a book about fossils and evolution, but in the book he didn't have any pictures of transitional fossils, you know, an ape man or a dinosaur becoming a bird. Well, that's actually a fashion that's derived since then, developed since then, but no examples in his book. And he had this book about evolution written by a fossil expert. And he was asked about that, and he said, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. He sounds like a creationist, doesn't he? He got into trouble over this because his evolutionary colleagues really got really angry about it. He said, yet Gould and the American Museum people, these are actual other paleontologists in the United States, are hard to contradict when they say there are no transitional fossils. I will lay it on the line, there's not one such fossil which one can make a watertight argument. And that's not the impression you get when you watch nature documentaries, is it? No. What about dinosaurs? That's a favourite thing to indoctrinate children with evolution. And you go to the museums, they've got a big display about dinosaurs and how they show evolution. Millions of years evolution has all just been drilled in. And kids are fascinated by dinosaurs, so they take in these messages with them. Well, what about dinosaurs? Do they show evolution? Do the fossils of dinosaurs show evolution? Because there's lots of dinosaur fossils been found. In fact, here's the different sorts of dinosaurs. Top here, you probably recognise some of these as sauropod dinosaurs, like Apatosaurus and so on. Over here you've got Stegosaurus, and you've got T-Rex and so on. You recognise some of them? Just by silhouettes, you know, they're out there, aren't they? You see them all the time. And kids love them, and they can name them. You'd be surprised how many dinosaurs kids could name. You know? Well, here's a diagram taken from Science Journal. Now, Science Journal asked Dr. Paul Sereno, who was considered the world's expert in dinosaur evolution, to write a review about dinosaur evolution. And this is what he wrote. This is the diagram from his article. And here we have different sorts of dinosaurs at the top here. And the black lines running down through the here, this is running down through the rock layers, and the dark black lines represent the fossil evidence. For example, Brachiosauridae is a Brachiosaurus, okay? So they got them in a special family. And here's the fossil evidence for Brachiosaurus down here. And then down the bottom here, you got common ancestor of all the dinosaurs. You can't see it at the back, but I'll just colour it in a minute. But believe me, it says Dinosauria there. And then from that is this family tree showing all the evolution of all the dinosaurs. Now, the only fossil evidence are the dark black lines, which you can see at the back. Okay, I'll colour in the rest of it in red and blue. Now you can see it. You see the family tree? Now let's erase the family tree that's not based on the fossil evidence. There's no family tree. The fossil evidence does not show dinosaur evolution. I didn't make it up. There are thousands of fossils of these, but where are all the thousands of fossils of their common ancestors that show evolution?
Is that slide available on the internet?
Not that I know of. You can look it up and get it from Science Journal. My colleagues have been pressuring me to write an article about this, so it would be on the internet. Taz is nodding. Yeah, exactly. This is the sort of thing. But it's not the only one. You can pick up any book, any actual fossil book on dinosaurs or anything else, and you'll see these diagrams. And they have red lines representing the fossil evidence, and then all the imagination showing the family tree. It's not just dinosaurs, it's across the board.
How can they be so blind to their own evidence?
Because they don't want to believe in God. That's why they're so blind. It's about God, you see. It's not about the evidence. We must explain things without God. What is the explanation for how everything got to be here without God? Evolution. So it must be a fact, because God doesn't exist. That's their mode of thinking. So, Stephen Gould, actually, just mentioned a while ago, said the evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of the branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of the fossils. Actually, I would dispute the nodes of the branches as well. It's just got the tips of the branches. That's all we've got. We fancy ourselves as the only, this is the paleontologists, the fossil experts, fancy ourselves as the only true students of life's history, yet to preserve our favourite account of evolution by natural selection, we view our data as so bad we never see the very process we profess to study. Right? So it's a con. It's a huge con that the fossils show evolution. In fact, if fossils don't show evolution never happened. You can talk all your luck about comparisons of living things and so on. It's all inference. But if the fossils don't show it, it never happened. But Richard Dawkins says, oh, we don't need fossils anymore because we've got molecular biology. I'm sorry, Richard, if it doesn't show it in the fossils, it didn't happen. You can't claim the fossil record is so incomplete when so many thousands and millions of fossils, all sorts of different things. Where are their common ancestors? They're not in the fossil record. And Richard Dawkins said, evolution has been observed, it's just it hasn't been observed while it's happening. Can he hear himself? Can he hear himself? There's something else the fossils show us, which actually confirms what the Bible says about God creating things after their kind. Now they're called living fossils. And so he does have a face. Sorry, now. This is a fossil shrimp or prawn. It's supposed to be 360 million years old, according to the dating of things. And here's a modern one. And there are thousands and thousands of examples, probably millions, but there are at least thousands of examples of these. This is a Cambrian sea, 500 million years ago supposedly, and you look at many of the creatures there, they're still around today, and they're unchanged. A bit bigger, a bit smaller, pretty well unchanged. Starfish, jellyfish, snails, brachiopods, clams, sponges, all sorts of things are still in the oceans today. You go snorkeling and see them. They haven't changed. After kind, after kind, after kind. You can see it. It's staring you in the face. Things become extinct. But the things are still, there's so many things are still around unchanged. How could something stay unchanged if evolution works to change things, say, worms into humans over millions of years? How can anything stay unchanged? It doesn't add up. And the fact there are just so many examples of these so-called living fossils. And you can look up more of them. But one of the claims in school textbooks and university textbooks is similarities prove evolution. You know, look at the similarities in limb structures it proves evolution. For example, you have human forearm here, and you have a frog's leg. And we have 5 fingers, they have 5 toes. We have 2 bones here, they have 2 bones there, they have 1 bone here, they have 1 bone there. Wow, there's proof of evolution, because we have common ancestors with frogs. That explains it. I know we had a common creator rather than a common ancestor. In fact, when we look at similarities in, say, cars, for example, other than the fact they all have 4 wheels and 2 headlights and a windscreen and things like that, but the original VW Beetle and the original Porsche had lots of similarities in the design because they had the same designer. Dr. Porsche designed both of them. And so when we see similarities in design, we could have, there's a common creator or a common designer as an explanation, because that's not allowed, is it? Because that's God. See, it's about God, it's not about science. Well, did God leave any patterns in living things which actually would thwart the attempt to make it common ancestry rather than common creator? Well, he did. This is one of them. If you look at the development of a frog's foot and a human's foot or hand, you see that the frog has little buds that grow outwards to form the toes. With the human, though, a plate forms, and the material between the toes or fingers dissolves to actually leave the toes or fingers behind. A different process arrives at the similar pattern. If it was due to common ancestry, it would be due to the same process. Different process is not common ancestry. It's common design. And there are many things like that. For example, if you look at a mako shark and a bluefin tuna, mako sharks I don't like to see in the surf, they're man-eaters. But in their tail, see they have a narrow tail and they've got a very, very strong swimming. How do they do that? They've got their muscles for moving their tail up in their body, up here, both of them, and they attach to their tail through tendons. Like our muscles for our fingers are actually up in our arm here, and they attach through tendons. If you had your muscles down your hand, you have a great big clumpy hand, you wouldn't have the dexterity. It's like this for them. And why do they have the muscles up in their body? Because their bodies actually can raise the temperature of the muscles, make the muscles more efficient. Whereas if they're in the tail, it'd be cold because of all the water flowing around them, because particularly both of those like cold water. And so this is a similar design in 2 sea creatures that have no explanation through a common ancestor. So how do the evolutionists explain that? They say, oh, it's convergence. They put evolutionary in front of it to make it look like it's got something to do with evolution. But it's actually got nothing to do with evolution. It's a huge problem for evolution. In fact, Dr. Simon Conway Morris wrote a book about this homoplazy, it's called, or homology, because the argument of similarity means common ancestry. What about similarities which can't be due to common ancestry? How do you explain those? A huge problem for the evolutionary story. You think about the ichthyosaurus, a marine reptile, it's probably extinct, a shark and a killer whale. Very similar body structures, but it can't be due to common ancestry. It can't be due to evolution. And there are many examples of this. They call this homoplasy. They give a special scientific term to it. It means they sort of own it in a way, you know. But homoplasy means similarities which are not due to evolution, not due to common ancestry. And take the camera eye, for example. We have a camera-style eye, and so does a particular worm called an annelid and the octopus. They're different in some ways, but very similar in other ways. They're all camera-type eye, but do we have a common ancestor which could explain that similarity? No. And so the evolutionists have to say that these evolved independently. And isn't evolution clever to arrive at the same design? In fact, eyes are supposed to have evolved, this is supposed to have evolved at least 6 times, and vision at least 40 times independently. It isn't incredible that anything can see, but according to evolutionists, it had to evolve independently at least 40 times. Because their evolutionary story can't explain it through common ancestry. Here's a microbats have echolocation, not like the fruit bats. Fruit bats in Australia, there's one fruit bat species that has echolocation, not here. But the fruit bats don't have echolocation, they use vision and and so on to look at things. But the microbats are little insectivorous bats. You find those flitting around lampposts and stuff after insects at times. And the dolphin, of course, has echolocation or sonar. A recent study, 2013, just recently published, scientists looked at the molecular differences or similarities between microbats and dolphins. Both have sonar. Can't have a common ancestor to explain the common sonar. So sonar must have evolved independently, according to their way of thinking, separately. So the sonar evolved separately in microbats and dolphins. To their great surprise, they found that there are 200 spots on the DNA where the same changes had occurred to actually accommodate echolocation. 200 spots, the same, through chance. Isn't evolution marvellous? They can't hear themselves. These things shout design, incredible, intelligent design. Scott Todd, Kansas State University, said this. This summarises what happens. Even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, which it does, such an hypothesis is excluded from science because it is not naturalistic. Naturalistic nature is all there is. There's no creator. Now, is science the search for naturalistic causes, or is it the search for logical causes? It used to be the search for logical causes. It's become the search for naturalistic causes because it's been hijacked by the humanists, secular humanists. It was once a Christian enterprise. Modern science came out of the Reformation particularly, and there was some science before that, but the flowering of modern science came about because of Christian thinking, especially the rediscovery of Genesis, the fallenness of man, and the needs for checks and balances and so on, and do experiments and so on. And you can read that by Dr. Peter Harrison is at Oxford University, I think, has written about this, written a book about this. So, C.S. Lewis said, was it devised to keep out God? Does the whole vast structure of modern naturalism, nature is all there is, depend not on positive evidence, but simply on an a priori metaphysical prejudice? There's big words there, but a priori means just a prior assumption. Metaphysical, religious, philosophical idea. Prejudice, you know that? Prejudice.
How long have you been like that?
Well, he'd been dead for quite some time, so I didn't write it in 2003. This is actually a revisiting of his works, but that was probably back in the 1940s, maybe 50s. But
So he was on it early.
sorry?
He was on it pretty early.
Oh yes, he was onto it pretty early, yeah. So was it devised not to get in facts, but to keep out God? It was designed to keep out God. That's what. And we've been, our whole Western society has been hoodwinked by this idea, and we are keeping out God. You do a survey in high schools and ask young people what they believe, and a third of them say they're atheists. Another third say that they believe in the Force. Another third say they believe in God, whatever that means. Some sort of cosmic force or something. But what's the Force? That comes from Star Wars. Is the Force in Star Wars? And if you think about Star Wars, and they're great sci-fi movies, I'm not sort of knocking them, but there is a religious undertone in the whole thing, and that is Buddhism. That is this cosmic force in the universe which drives people to be either on the light side or the dark side. They don't use the words good and evil because there's no such concept of good and evil in Buddhism. But you're on the light side of the Force or the dark side of the Force, and the whole idea of the thing is to be on the light side of the Force. For some reason or other, it's better to be on the light side. Who knows why? Of course, coming from Christian culture, we say, yes, it's good to be on the light side, but, you know, why would it be better? It's all the Force. And so the concepts of good and evil just disappear in this sort of way of thinking. Because, folks, this is where our society is going. And the rationale for it is this whole evolutionary worldview. It's designed to get rid of God. Michael Roos, who was an evolutionist and an atheist, a philosopher, I just finished with this quote. He said, evolution is promoted by its practitioners as more than mere science. Evolution is
promulgated as an ideology, a secular religion, a full-fledged alternative to Christianity, with meaning and morality. Evolution is a religion. This was true of evolution in the beginning. It is true of evolution still today. Evolution therefore came into being as a kind of secular ideology, an explicit substitute for Christianity. That's what it's about. What does the Bible say? The Bible says, for his invisible attributes, God's invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. So no matter how much people hang on to evolution as an excuse for jettisoning God, they are without excuse, because the Bible says that the fact that he created things is obvious, so obvious, it's willful blindness, in fact, to deny it. But folks, there are many of our young people today have been hoodwinked because they hear nothing else. They hear nothing else at school, they hear nothing else at home, they hear nothing else on the television. They don't think there's any other way of thinking about it. And so we would appeal to people to get involved in sharing the information. There's some free magazines out there, grab and share them with others. Creation magazine, you subscribe to it. You know, we had one guy who told us recently that he subscribes to the magazine. He likes to hang on to them, you know, because he can go and revisit things. So you don't have to do that anymore, because after 12 months, the articles go up on the website, so you can revisit them on the website. But the website doesn't have all the lovely colour and everything of the magazine. So the magazine is a wonderful thing to give to somebody to read. And give the whole magazine, the colour and everything, they'll read it. And they'll read it more than just the article you gave them to read. They'll read the whole lot, lots of it. And they'll come back, and many times they'll come back and ask for more. And they're on the track. They're on the track to redemption. But you can get Creation magazine, and there's some sign-up sheets out at the back there, and you can sign up for it. Here's just one testimony. You guys make evangelism easy. I just give a Creation magazine to somebody, and then the next time I see them and talk about it. Yeah? Just like that. We have so many testimonies from people. Just a few books that can help you fill in some of the gaps on this. Refuting Evolution by Dr. Safety. Great, understandable, easy to read book, dealing with all the best arguments for evolution. Why do we say they're the best arguments? Because the National Academy of Science in the United States put out a book teaching teachers how to teach evolution so that kids would believe it. So this book actually refutes all those best arguments. So you get the book, read those, so you can have all the answers to the best arguments they've got, which don't stack up. You see, it's not a very thick book, so it doesn't take long to refute the arguments if you actually know your stuff. It's not very, nothing I talked about this morning is difficult. They're simple concepts. They're simple concepts. And you can point people to more detailed articles if they need it. But this one here, The Greatest Hoax, and this is more in depth because Richard Dawkins wrote a book where he claimed to prove evolution once and for all. So this is my book that proves evolution. And so I thought, well, we better do something about that. So Dr. Safety demolished it. In fact, a review, Jim Fletcher in WorldNet Daily said, Dr. Jonathan Safety of Creation Ministries International just penned a devastating response to Dawkins. The book takes aim at all of Dawkins' ideological arrows and, in this reviewer's opinion, destroys them all in mid-flight. This is one of the most important books this year for biblical Christians. And so that was a couple of years ago, but it's still very relevant. There's also a book out there, Evolution, the Grand Experiment, by Dr. Carl Lerner, lives in the United States, and he's travelled the world with his wife, actually visiting museums, talking to evolutionary paleontologists, and because he's a doctor, medical doctor, he sort of gets in where, you know, ordinary people wouldn't get in, but he gets in and talks, and he's doing documentary. His wife's a photographer and a videographer, and they're filming and stuff and doing a documentary about fossils. And the admissions that these people make about what the fossils don't show are amazing. And there's a video that goes with it. I think both are out the front there. We've got a very limited selection. But I think you can get the combination of the book and the video for a big production. There's a big special on at present, but the video goes along with it, and actually see the footage of these paleontologists admitting, oh no, the fossils, the whale fossils don't really show the changes that we said they did when they went, we know it's the school textbooks, but it's not really like that at all. It's just it's just amazing, and that can be really something to open people up, to show them they've been hoodwinked. And if you want a DVD already produced about things that we've just been talking about, not exactly the same, But dealing with the sort of mutation, natural selection don't add up for evolution. Creatures do change but not evolution is also available on the table.